Thank you, Shalil, for writing this absolutely marvelous book.
Thank
I'm
you.
going to start by asking you, since we only have 35 minutes, I know that this is part of the series of the books on the communities by Aleph, but do tell us your very own initiative that propelled you to write this book.
Well, the man who made me write the book is sitting there, David Davidar. Thank you. And saving it and prodding me and getting me to get on with it so that I spend less time on Twitter and more on actually writing the book. But the propelling part was that the first book had come out on Bengalis, and he was very keen to see how someone could write the story of Gujaratis in an engaging manner. So he asked me how I would write it. And my son, who's now 35, but then he was 25, Udayan, was also in the same room at his office. And not prepared for the question, I responded in a stream of consciousness manner about, I'll write about the food and love and sex and money and enterprise and going abroad and killing people. I mean, which is where all of those things we are rather good at. So I mentioned that, and then he had a call and he had to go out. And Udayan tell me, Dad, I want to read this book. I said, okay, but now David needs to publish it. And before I could continue when he came back, he said that, get started. And that's how it began, and now it's part of the series, and it's probably twice the size he anticipated, but what I'd sent him was 3 times the size, so yeah.
Yeah, it's a great book. There's lots and lots of stuff to mull over, but it's very eminently readable because the chapters are very small. But tell us a bit about the process. Tell us how long it took and your research, and how did you put it all together, because you've covered Gujarati history, you've covered Gujarati emotions, Gujarat today, etc., and we'll talk about some more of that. But was there a process to all of this, and the time, and how did you put it all together, and then what did David do for it to be what it is today?
Yeah, so at one level, the structure was in my mind, because I didn't know how to do it. I mean, one could write it as a pure history and start from Dholavira, the first, and Lothal no Timbo, as we say it in Gujarat. And in Gujarati, I mean, Bhagwan Lal Indraji finding, the earliest of the scriptures which show the expanse of the Ashoka Empire. I could start with that and bring it all the way to Narendra Modi and beyond, which would be a very good historical account. But that would not be it, because Gujaratis are not only in Gujarat. I grew up in Bombay. And so one thing I say up front is that I'm an outsider looking in and an insider looking out. Not just from the fact that I live abroad now, so there's that bit of outside, but the fact that Bombay is both of Gujarat and yet not of Gujarat. A lot of the money that has been made in Bombay is made by Gujaratis. Gujaratis have made Bombay in a very, very big way. But Bombay has also shaped Gujarat's thinking. Some of the most early modernist writers you can think of, whether it is Narmad or Manilal or Govardhan Ram, they were all students of Elphinstone College. And they were from Surat and Nadiad, and Nadiad is my ancestral home. And people in Nadiad will tell you that Ame Sakshar Bhumi na chahiye. We are from the land of literators. Yes, those people were born there, but they were made by Bombay. So there's that relationship which I was fascinated by. And then if we look at the diaspora, they are literally everywhere. There's a poem by a Parsi Gujarati poet called Khabardar. Jahan jahan vase ek Gujarati, tyan sada kaal Gujarat. Wherever a Gujarati lives, there's Gujarat forever. And I found it at unexpected places. Grey Street in Johannesburg, Ruby in Muscat, in Harrow, where there's a sign saying, "Ahi thukwani maja che," in Gujarati. Spitting is prohibited here, written in Gujarati in Harrow, because, we do that too. We do a lot of good things, but we also leave our marks of various types everywhere. And then you go to look at the motels in America. That's also another area. And Serangoon Road is full of Tamils in Singapore. I lived there 8 years. But you go to the East Coast Road, near the Meyer Road and all that, where Subhash Chandra Bose used to live, and that's a Gujarati area. So we create our little enclaves wherever we go. And so it's that outside-inside relationship that I was very interested in.
You've spoken, and most people think of Gujaratis, whether in India, in various places like in the south or in Bengal or in the diaspora, as people who are soft, businessmen, typically sort of bania.
And businesswomen. And businesswomen.
And businesswomen, yes.
Yeah.
But
Derani Jethani no ice cream in Ahmedabad, all of that, yeah.
So what I wanted to ask you, and it's something that you allude to in one of your chapters, is that most people don't think of Gujaratis being in the services of the armed forces or the navy. My grandfather was also something similar, and he was a policeman. It was very unusual for a policeman in Ahmedabad to be a Gujarati. Can you share with us some of the stories that you've shared with about people, in fact, some which I read are several generations in the services, so that is another facet of being Gujarati.
Yeah, so there are two types of things. Being in services, there are two aspects to it. One is to make, an army cannot walk or march on an empty stomach. And if you look at the storekeepers of many of the army facilities, you'll find Gujaratis there. Netaji Subhash Chandra Bose and his Indian National Army, the main storekeeper was a man called Girish Kothari in Singapore, who was a trader and actually was a karyana, like a grocer in Penang, in Malaysia. So he was doing that. I accidentally found out that one of my cousins in California, her husband, has also been part of the storekeeping of the US Air Force. And now he has become a cybersecurity expert for the... So if you look at the supporting services of the army, there have been many Gujaratis. That's one part of it. The other is that Gujaratis do actually join the army. And there are several stories in the book. The one to which you allude is a Mehta family who was part of the Gurkha Brigade. And he was part of both the 65 and 71 wars. And he nearly died in the 65 war. And you know how he goes through the entire process of... And you know, he's a very lovely man. I mean, the way he talks his stories, where he keeps quoting poetry and all that. Because he said that when he was about to die, he thought of a poem by Kalapi called Rakta Tapakti So So Jholi Samarangal Thi Ave Kesar Varni Kamal Kelika Komal Be Sage Bichave Ghayal Marta Matare Matne Azadi Gave, which essentially is that there's blood flowing down, and in the field of battlefield, the man feels that he has to fight because he has to fight for the freedom of the country. And that's a lovely poem. If you've been in a Gujarati medium school, as I have, you would know such poetry by heart. And this is what he was telling me about. There's another young kid called Navang Kapadia who I knew. He died at 25 in Kupwara because he was a captain in the Gurkha Brigade. And he was chasing terrorists, and the terrorists saw him before he could, and he was helping, he was going there to take, release one of the Indian soldiers who was taken away, and he was shot and killed. And now, near his home in Bombay, there's a chowk named after him, Shahid Navang Kapadia Chowk. And his father is a very well-known mountaineer, and therefore his name is Navang, named after Navang Gombu, the first man to climb the Everest twice. So that's another thing worth keeping in mind. And, there was this completely mad, I say it in an affectionate way, man called Nariman, who's not in the book, but it's a great story, that he wanted to join the army, but he wanted to join the British army. And Murli Ranganathan has done a very good translation of his book called Rangbhumi Ni Rakhad, which is, if you fight, the story of my ramblings through battlefield. And he joins as a Tommy in the First World War. And the most interesting thing is what people like Sonal Shukla, very well-known sociologist who died, unfortunately, a couple of years ago, she told me that and Niranjan Bhagat, the great poet, also told me the same thing, that what you're after is courage. And courage is not something to be shown only by fighting on the battlefield. You can show courage by taking risks. And who takes a greater risk than being a vegetarian, go to the deepest part of Africa, set up a shop, and do business on credit with the local community, not knowing whether you'll go bankrupt, someone will come and mug you, or you might even get killed. But people did that. Dukawala, as they were called in Swahili. And they were everywhere. And that shows a different kind of courage. So they're not cowards, because after all, Gandhi said non-violence is a form of courage and bravery, and he was Gujarati.
You've spoken also about the polycultureness of Gujarat. And in your book, you've included Parsis, Muslims, other communities, and you've talked at length about several sub-communities in the Patels and all. But I had my own doubts. Aren't Parsis a lot unto themselves? And
of course they are.
Why did they?
But so are the Patels.
Why did you choose to have them under the rubric of Gujaratis?
Because I think Gujarati is a language and not a religion. So just as Hasina Wajid and Mamta Banerjee are both Bengalis, just as Ziaul Haq and Manmohan Singh were Punjabis, by the same token, Ratan Tata, Dhirubhai Ambani and Azim Premji are all Gujaratis.
Thank you for clarifying that. It makes a lot of sense. I went to school for a short period in Ahmedabad in something called Loyola School. And we used to have a Jesuit father called Father Zavala, who all the students were very fond of. In your book, I also found a reference to an early Spanish Jesuit priest who did Father Valles, if I'm saying
No,
it
he was
right.
Bayesh,
Valle.
but we, because it was Valles, and since we murder every pronunciation in the world, from snacks to snakes, we called him Valles, thinking it was Wallace, but he was Bayesh, yeah.
And so can you tell us a bit about him and his relationship with Forbes and a little bit of that history in the creation of early Gujarati literature and history?
So Father Bayesh was, he died a few years ago, and the interesting thing about his story is that he taught science in Gujarat, and he would ride around on a bicycle, and he was a very good friend of Kakasaheb Kalelkar, who some of you might know as a great freedom fighter, and he wrote the first Jodani Kosh, the dictionary in Gujarati, Dattatreya Kalelkar. And Gandhi used to call Kalelkar Savaya Gujarati, and he said, "Tame Savaya na Savaya Gujarati." That means if Kalelkar was 1 plus 1.25 Gujarati, he was 1.50 Gujarati. And he was an extremely good teacher. He taught at St. Xavier's College in Ahmedabad and became incredibly popular. And what he told me, I did have one phone conversation with him. Basically what he said was that, look, I don't care what you write and how you write, but please don't consider, Gujarati is a language, we have embraced it, it's become part of me to the extent that when he went home to Spain, which was where he was born, he said, I'm going abroad to Spain, and then I'll come home to Ahmedabad.
And Forbes?
And Forbes is another very interesting person. He died very young, unfortunately, Alexander Kinloch Forbes. He came essentially earlier to work in the Bombay state and was supposed to work on Maharashtra. But he took a great interest in Gujarati culture, and he promoted the publication and printing of the first newspapers in Surat and so on. And he had formed a wonderful relationship with a poet, Dalpatram. And essentially what he did was that the two of them came together and started compiling stories and narratives about the troubadours and the balladeers of what we call Bhat and Charan in Gujarati. So he would go to Saurashtra with a pistol, sit on the floor, cross-legged properly, and listen to and collect those stories, and wrote a 4-part book called Rasmala. And if you read that Rasmala, it is the early almanac of what Gujarati is all about. And if you look at, the stories are there. Some of them are mythical stories, so you shouldn't take them as history. The sad thing is that a lot of Gujaratis today are taking these stories as history and not as myths. But they're lovely stories, and those stories tell us about who we are, and that has influenced a lot of writers later on, such as Karan Ghelo, the novel that was written by Nand Shankar Mehta. A lot of those historical novels, their origin goes back to what was found there. He happened to be a very close friend of my great-great-grandfather, a man called Mansukh Ram Tripathi. And the two of them together formed the Gujarati Vernacular Society, and later what came to be known as Forbes Sabha. But since we mispronounce everything, everybody in Bombay will call it Farbas Sabha. But yeah, it is there, it's still present, and they have a lovely library with some beautiful ancient manuscripts and so on are there. And he promoted the language, and then sadly he died very early. He died in his mid-40s. Dalpat Ram wrote a very melodramatic thing called Farbas Virah, the fact that he could not bear the parting. And Dalpat Ram speculated on cotton when he should not have, when the civil war was ending, and lost everything. And Forbes made sure that Dalpat Ram was back on his feet through donations from Jagannath Shankar Sheth and Premchand Roychand and people like that in Bombay. So that was one part of it. And of course, as a result of that, he got to know Mansukh Ram's cousin, so he's also an ancestor of mine, Govardhan Ram Tripathi. Those of you who know Bollywood cinema of the old, Saraswati Chandra, the film, was based on 4 novels that he wrote, which is, even if I say so, the great Gujarati novel, yeah.
Most people equate Gandhi with ahimsa, and that's a word we are familiar with. It's also part of the Jain religious sort of tenets. But in your book, you also talk about another very fantastic and almost intangible feeling called asmita. And you've had many people, not just Gujarati Jains, but even Gujarati Muslims, speak about that. Could you share with us what this actually means and what it means for Gujaratis in Gujarat and outside?
So it's one of the most misunderstood and misexplained words. It means the identity. I mean, if you were to be very clear about it. But if you really go to the root of it, and I was explaining this thing very well by the poet Sitanshu Yashaschandra, the root is us, which is the being. And essentially what asmita means is self-awareness. It's a humble concept. about awareness of who you are and what your position is in the society. So if we look at the earliest exponent, it's people like Narsi Mehta, the medieval poet, who actually talks about Asmita, Akhil Brahmanma Ekach Shri Hari, that in the entire universe there's only one God. Or he talks about Vaishnav Janto Janene Kahiye Je Peed Parai Jane Re. The good person is one who looks after the other people. So it's a very selfless thing about becoming part of a society and being part of that awareness. That gets refined further later by Narmad in Surat, who talks about Swabhiman, self-pride, where he talks about kissing the land on which he's born from, and he comes from Surat. But then it's brought again more to the non-martial aspects by Govardhan Ram Tripathi to Saraswati Chandra, which is an individual's place in a society, more importantly an individual's place in a joint family, which is what Saraswati Chandra is really, the politics between an individual and the elders in the family. Fast forward to Kanhaiya Lal Munshi, who I wouldn't say that weaponizes, because it's been weaponized today, but he gives a muscular sense to that word. And what he does to it is that he takes it, some of you who may have studied history would know a book called The Wonder That Was India by A.L. Basham. Now, in a way, Munshi does The Wonder That Was Gujarat before this Islamic invasion came. What he's talking about is the Chalukya period. And the Chalukya period is the Solanki age, as it was called. And if you go back to that part of Gujarat's history, it had a lot of influence of Jain seers and Munis, who were able to, Siddharth Jai Singh and Kumar Pal, and these are the kings of that time. And there is this perception in the Gujarati mind that that was a golden age. Then, of course, Muhammad Ghazni comes and Ahmad Shah Abdali comes and they ruined Gujarat. But the Muslims who came to Gujarat didn't just come by camels and horses to invade and pillage. They also came by boats. And they came to trade from Mombasa, from Aden, from Sokotra, from Muscat. And they all came on the Saurashtra coast. So interestingly, when people talk about the destruction of Somnath, everyone remembers the fact that it was destroyed very badly and so on, but no one talks about the fact that no mosque in the area was harmed in retaliation by anybody. And the reason was that those mosques were built by locally absorbed Muslims who were traders, who were friends. So that was part of the Asmita, which is increasingly being forgotten. And from there, it becomes a political concept. It becomes a political concept through the re-erection of Somnath in 1950-51, 51-52. And secondly, at the time of the Narmada movement, where any attack on Gujarat or Gujaratis is described as an attack on Asmita of Gujarat, the identity of Gujarat. So that's one thing. And it becomes from that into arrogance and frankly a license to be bigoted after 2002. Because then what happens is that when the whole world is angry with what Gujaratis have done to each other, at that time, there is a Gaurav Yatra that Narendra Modi starts, and at that time the word again comes, and the song, Jai Jai Garvi Gujarat from Narmad, and all are being seen in a martial sense, which was never ending. So what was meant to be self-awareness has moved to pride, to arrogance, to bigotry, and that's a very sad trajectory, and we have to reclaim it in the original sense.
Moving away a bit, tell us, before we get to Gandhiji, a bit about the situation with Dalits in Gujarat.
It is bad. I mean, the statistics are, the main Gujarati NGO that worked on Dalit rights, Navsarjan, technically can't function anymore because its FCNR certificate has been taken away. FCRA certificate has been taken away, run by Martin McQuan. And it started out of an incident in Golana where Rajputs were very angry because a few Dalits accidentally hit somebody's cycle. And therefore, there was a retaliatory violence. What it takes for someone to kill someone is usually very minor and incidental. Like somebody feels insulted. There's a story that I have in the book where one man was beaten up and then killed, and then his body was hung up as if it was a suicide, because an upper caste or a dominant caste man came to borrow his cycle, and he gave an older cycle rather than a newer cycle, and the person got angry. A Dalit wants to go on a marriage procession on a horse, and he gets beaten up saying that, Dalits have no right to sit on horses. And these are recent stories. I mean, many of you will remember what happened in Una in 2016, where these Dalits were actually, treating the carcass, because after the cow has died, you need to treat the leather so that it makes the chappals that many of us are wearing, the so-called ahimsak chappals of Khadi and Khadi Gramodyog movement. But when that was done, they were stripped to the back. I mean, they had their trousers on, but the shirts were taken off, and they were whipped. 4 men. And then after that, there was this Gaurav, the march against it which went to Una on the 16th of August. They wanted to go on the 15th August, but the police wouldn't let them into town, Una. So they met there on 16th August. I was there at that time. Lot of anger, lot of anguish, and lot of perception that this is not right. The only thing I learned is that I grew up in Bombay, right? So I'm used to Dalit Panthers, who are much more militant and volatile, and their poetry is angrier, Namdev Dasal and all of them. And you don't see that in Gujarat. And when I asked Martin McMahon, he said it's because of the influence of Gandhi, because Gandhi didn't want us to be violent. But he said Ambedkar was unacceptable, now he's unavoidable. And I think that's a very good way to look at how Gujarati Dalits should look at it, and how Gujaratis themselves have to look at themselves about what they're doing to the Dalits.
So let's now come, the session is supposed to be, the subtitle is From Mahatma to Modi. And you touched upon the riots, you've talked about the Dalits. You've also written at length about the nexus between the businessmen and the rise of Modi, the two big business houses that have grown large over the period of time. Can you just elaborate a bit on that for the audience?
Yeah, sure. So one of the interesting, this is an old story. I was in 1986, I traveled through the state and did a piece called the Gujarat Diary for a magazine called Imprint, which is no longer published. Its editor was Veer Sangvi. And he said that, and at that time there was this massive anti-reservation riot, which had turned communal later. He said, he's a Gujarati too. He said, you are a Gujarati, find out why we are so violent. So I went and spent about 3 weeks, and that became the starting point, and I've referred to that journey also in the book. But towards the end of that trip, I met Madhav Singh Solanki, who had resigned as the chief minister because he had got 149 out of 180 seats, but the protest was so severe, he had to quit. And I said that we are the land of Gandhi, how come this happened? And how come this violence has happened? And his reply was, आपने तो हमेशा हिंसा का था, आपने शांत करवा माटे आपने गांधीजी ની જરૂર પડી. We were always violent. To calm us down, we needed a Gandhi. And I think it's something worth keeping in mind that riots have always been part of the fabric, going back to 1890s, 1920s Godhra, 1940s, 1960s. 1969, the Gujarat riot was terrible. I mean, there was going to be the first ever cricket test match in Ahmedabad would have taken place then when Graham Dowling's team came and Indrajit Singh was going to debut as a player. But that match in the end came to Bombay. So it has always been, and then of course you have 80s, and then of course you have 2002. So violence has been part of our system. Now the more interesting question is that did Gujarat make Gandhi or Gandhi make Gujarat? Similarly, did Gujarat make Modi or Modi made Gujarat? And those are questions beyond one answer. Everyone will have their own answer. But if I have to put it down in a kind of almost glib manner, distinguish between the two, before I do that, let me quickly address the business nexus. The fact is that after 2002, lots of prominent business people, including Gujaratis like Deepak Parekh and Anu Aga and Cyrus Gazdar, spoke out against the riots very, very clearly. So the Gujarat business community, particularly Torrent and so on, as well as Gautam Adani, created the vibrant and resurgent Gujarat movement. And then you have all these summits that have taken place since then. And there's this great feeling that this is an attack on Gujarati identity and not on one particular politician about what happened. And that we are seeing the playing out of that throughout. But, I mean, if I have to distinguish between them, and this might sound glib, I don't mean to be glib, but I think there's something to it. Gandhi was a left-hander, Modi is a right-hander. Gandhi has terrible handwriting, Modi has extremely good handwriting. Both don't touch meat or alcohol. Both believe in women's emancipation. Both also believe at the same time in promoting cleanliness and so on. So there is that outward. Both are stubborn. Let's not forget that. But there is one difference. If a behavior change is needed, Gandhi will try to persuade you. Modi will give you instructions or order.
Where do we come from, the Gujaratis? Is there an Aryan theory? Is there a mix? Is there any historical references? You talked earlier of trading communities who would have stayed back, been with the local populace. So is there a sense of, in the early research by Forbes and others, like where are we from?
We are from everywhere, to be honest. I mean, if you look at the sociological and anthropological research, Gujarat is a more intermingled society than any other. I mean, the people have come, you can see from the surname, they've come from the Makran coast, they've come from Turkey, they've come from elsewhere, they've come from other parts of it. There's a huge Marathi constituency in Gujarat, thanks to the Gaekwads. I talked about Kaka Saheb Kalelkar. The Free India's first speaker was Purushottam Mavlankar, again, Marathi but Gujarati at the same time. So you have had that tradition too. Christians and Muslims are not languages, I mean, they are religions, but they are there too. And the language also keeps changing. And if you look at the Rajputs and Gujars, again, a very strong component. Many of them trace their origins, including the Hindus, trace their origins to Rajasthan and Haryana and so on. So to say that there's a Gujarati identity is challenging at one level, because when the state was formed, you had 350 princely states, some no bigger than maybe this complex, yeah? Sir M.V. Hall. So you had that. You had Kutch, which is closer links with Sindh than with Gujarat itself. And you had the Adivasi belt across the Chota Udaipur and so on. And then you have the North Gujarat, which is the dominant part of it that you can do. So all those things have become part of it, and they've been intermingled. And if you look at Ganesh Devi's work, which is in Tejgarh, outside Baroda, you will find a lot of intermingling and creation of language in spoken language and written script language, which varies across the other. So I think it is a great amalgam, and to call it as one unitary entity does disservice to the diversity.
There is, in a lot of our memory, the expulsion of Gujaratis from Uganda. It was a big moment where it was the first time where diasporic Gujaratis left. They went to Canada, they went to England, some came back. And there's a wonderful incident in the book. I'd love for you to share that with the audience about Idi Amin.
Is it the one about the hospital, the last one?
Yes, Idi Amin and the hospital
in the
nurse.
Hospital, yeah, no. So there's a woman called Vasanti Makwan, and I came across her name entirely accidentally when I was reading something and someone pointed it out to me. And she was in Uganda. She was a teenager, and they were expelled, and with one suitcase. And those of you who have seen Mississippi Masala, the film by Meera Nair, would know exactly that once they go there, they still are hankering for going back and making and many have gone back, actually, if you go now, because Yoweri Museveni, who replaced Idi Amin many years later, he has gone to the Swaminarayan temple in London and in Vancouver and all that, pleading the Ugandans, Gujaratis to come back, and many have come back and prospered. But sugar plantations was where Gujaratis were very big. But anyway, 70,000 of them had to leave within 3 months, and they did leave. And at that time, Vasanti was one of those who moved to England. And after that, she ends up marrying someone, moves to Canada. She becomes an assistant in a hospital as a nurse. And she takes a sabbatical. And she takes a sabbatical and ends up going to Saudi Arabia. And one day she's told that there is a very important patient coming, and you have to look after him. And she sees the name, and it is Idi Amin Dada. Because Idi Amin had been overthrown, and when he was overthrown, he became a very devout Muslim and went to Saudi Arabia and lived in exile. And he's there, and she's there to treat him. And she looks at him, and he's wondering who she is, because he's expecting a British nurse or whatever. And there's this Indian-looking woman. She said, "Do you remember you kicked out Asians? I'm one of them." And Idi Amin, the kind of life he led, he probably thought that she is now going to kill him. But no, I won't hurt you, because that's not what my culture tells me to. I'm going to look after you. But I want you to know, you tried to finish us, but we went and rebuilt our lives. And that's what she did. And of course, after her story became known, we are in a very vituperative and intolerant society right now. So she got a lot of abuse from people. Idi Amin did the right thing by kicking you out, and you should have been exterminated. And a lot of others said that this shows. And I said, why did you do it? She said, this is what Gandhi told us, taught us, that you have to forgive, then you can move on. So it was a very interesting.
Which leads me to the next question, that we've had these riots. There continue to be incidents of, as you mentioned before, difficult times, the othering of Muslims. I met a Parsi lawyer in Ahmedabad 2 years ago who said, maybe we'll be next. This sense of being further and further being alienated if you're not Hindu. So where in all of this is the memory of Gandhi? You talk about somebody like Harmony Singanaporia who walks, academics, other people like Makwan who continue to do Gandhi's work, Anu Aga. Where is this Gujarati conscience that still exists as explained by this story?
I think it does exist. It is not dominant. I wouldn't want to make, I'm not a census taker, so I can't tell you what's the majority because I've not done a head count. But it certainly exists because you look at voting percentages in rural Gujarat particularly, that's where the currency that the prevailing orthodoxy of India gets is very little. You do get election results which, tilt the other way. Of course, there's a dominant discourse which is very hard to discard completely, and it is a reality. Since 1995 or 1996, so we are talking about 5 plus 24, 29, 30 years, Gujarat has basically seen one-party rule. Absolutely, I mean, no question about it. And a large number of people have grown up in the state and in India after Babri Masjid was destroyed. And a significant number of people have grown up after 2002. So this is the generation that has only known high growth, that has no memory of socialism or ration cards, because they all have Aadhaar cards now, which is a different story altogether. And as a result of that, they are able to see things from a very different perspective. And they have different set of expectations, which are rising expectations. When they can't be met, the best thing is what Marx said, religion being the opium of the people. And therefore, that is being offered on a platter to them. But when you look at some of the work done by some of the people I do mention, Mittal Patel being one of them, Mekwan being another, Sushma Iyengar being another one, Archana Shah, the way she runs her garment business, Martin Makwan, who continues to have Manjula Pradeep. There are people like that who are what I would call, little candles which are trying to illuminate the place. Yes, Darshak is gone. Yes, Ravi Shankar Maharaj is no longer there. There's a very nice story from the 69 riots where Ravi Shankar Maharaj is trying to stop violence during the riots. And he comes out of the car. Everyone says, Ravi Shankar Maharaj ki jai. So he says, now, have mane sambhalo, listen to me. Na, aje tamne nahi sambhaliye. Today we will not listen to you. That is the arrogant view, which is the dominant view, the loud view. But we have to remain hopeful. And hope doesn't necessarily mean that something will turn out right. But believing in something because we know that that is the right path. And this is not me saying it. It's Václav Havel who says it. So, I mean, if you want to credit, he's the person to be credited. But I think there is a way to see in these things. And it applies not just to Gujarat. It applies all over the country. Because the mood has changed. And if the mood has changed, this is where we have to look for it. The individuals who are trying to make a difference at small levels and quietly and reclaim.
I'd like to finally end our conversation with you talking about the women, and specifically one from the family of the Sarabhais. Can you share with us something about Ansuya Ben and then go down a couple of generations to what Mallika's daughter Anahita is doing?
Sure.
Because in a way it kind of bookends what different generations do and what Gujaratis continue to do with what you've just talked about, the little lights of Gujarati conscience that still exists.
Yeah, so Ram Guha, when a book on Sarabhais was coming out, actually asked that why is it that when we talk about Renaissance families in India, we talk about the Tagores but not about Sarabhais. And if we look at Sarabhais, the number of Sarabhai women who went to jail during the freedom struggle, starting with Mridula Sarabhai, then we look at what Gira Sarabhai does in setting up NID, but let's not go ahead of the story. Let's start with Ansuya Ben. She goes to London to become a doctor. Then she's a Jain, and she realizes that she has to dissect a frog. So she doesn't want to do it, so she ends up studying sociology and anthropology and goes to London School of Economics. Comes back, gets swayed by Gandhi. Now, her brother is Ambalal Sarabhai, who, again, is a great champion of Gandhi, but this story pits them apart, and Erik Erikson's book, Gandhi's Truth, goes into that. So for those who are interested, should look at that book. But I think what happened is something very interesting, that when Gandhi decided to take Dulabhai, who was a Dalit, into his ashram, all the Sethiyas, as they were called in Ahmedabad, the rich people, said, we will not support you. We will not give you any money. And at that stage, at that moment, what happens is that Ambalal comes and gives 25,000 rupees. Ambalal has a strike. And at that time, the union is led by Ansuya Ben, which then goes on to become Seva, and Ila Bhatt is inspired by her. So you have Ansuya, you have Mridula, you have Gira. Then you have, of course, Mrinalini, who marries Vikram Sarabhai. Mrinalini comes from, of course, Captain Lakshmi's family. So that's a different family. And their daughter is Mallika, who not only championed the rights of the tribals in the Narmada agitation, but championed the rights of the victims of the 2002 pogrom. And then their daughter Anahita, who begins the movement called Queer Abad, which tries to legitimize the acceptance of LGBT communities. And this is across 4 or 5 generations of one family. Howard Spodek, the American writer, called them the Medicis of Gujarat. And in a way they are. I mean, I'm sure it's not a perfect family. No family is perfect. But I think what they have done, and Lalbhais, we shouldn't forget the Lalbhais too. All the major BM Institute, HL College, IIMs, ISRO, Physical Research Laboratory that we have in Ahmedabad, great international institutions, these families have a role to play.
Thank you. Do we have time for questions? 10 minutes. Okay, so we'll take questions. Please share the mic and please ask a question.
I'm Aprameya and I have a question. So when you were talking about Muslim invasion in Gujarat.
Muslim?
So, invasion in Gujarat.
Uh-huh.
Yeah, so you were talking like Muslims not only came for invasion, they also came for trading.
Correct.
So didn't you think like, didn't the Gujaratis realize that when East India Company also came for trading and then started to attack India? So didn't the Gujaratis realize that history was repeating?
Well, the East India Company that came to Gujarat came only to trade. They set up a trading point in Surat. The wars that they fought were in Bengal and Madras, and these were distant places. So in a way, Gujarat basically faces the wrath of the British Raj through beatings. The earliest known example that you can paint, the most important known is the Dande March and Dharasana, after that, when the salt thing is attacked. And I think what Gujaratis were able to understand at that time to make the distinction between those who came to attack and rule and those who came to trade and become part. And I'm not even talking about the Mianas, and I'm not talking about the Siddhis, who have become completely intermingled in the society. So it's and the Chelias and so of them. One of the things that I learned while working on the book is that the sheer variety and range of differences of Muslim communities in Gujarat is probably one of the richest in India. I'm not saying it is the richest, because others would say that it's different elsewhere, but it is one of the richest in India.
Can you, while we're talking about this, also share the story of the East India Company? And who owns it now?
Oh yes, yeah. Do you know who owns the East India Company now? He's a schoolmate of mine called Sanjeev Mehta, Gujarati again, and he basically found that East India Company was revived by a bunch of British aristocrats who didn't know what to do with it because they had a brand in their names and in their hand. So what Sanjeev does is that he one by one starts buying them up. He's a very intrepid trader. There's a very short 4-page chapter about him, and it's worth reading that. But he one by one buys them, and finally one guy continues to hold out. And so on one day he goes to him and says that, look, here's a blank check. Here's my signature. You write the amount for your share. Either I will accept it if it's reasonable, and if it is not, then I will keep issuing more shares to myself, so your share becomes so small that you will become an insignificant shareholder. He writes a figure, and Sanjeev told me later that it's the best deal I ever made in my life. And then he said that it happened to be the 2nd of October, so he was very proud of it, the fact that on Gandhi's birthday, he had wrested back East India Company. It became very controversial because a lot of people, including Amitabh Ghosh, my friend, has said that how can an Indian own East India Company? And his response is very interesting. He said that, judge me badly if I treat my workers as badly as East India Company did, or if I do opium trade. I'm creating a brand, an experience, and I want to buy tea from sustainable farms and take Indian tea abroad. What's harm with it? And if I get a good brand name, and if people are going to walk into my shop, they're welcome. Yeah.
Was there something about Gujarat that actually made Gandhi? Was he special because of something about Gujarat?
Well, to the extent that he was influenced strongly by Putalibai, his mother, and the Jain influence that he had in the early days, and the whole idea about there's nothing wrong in going abroad to succeed, because that's a very innate. It's only the upper caste who have a problem about crossing the river. Crossing the black waters. So you have people like prominent writers who have gone abroad were excommunicated. But Gandhi didn't face that. So the idea of going abroad and making money, idea of succeeding, idea of being syncretic, that's also Gujarati part of it. And he does say that he gives Govardhan Ram and Saraswati Chandra a lot of credit because he read it as it was being written in the 1890s. So all of those traits that we know about Gandhi, there is a Gujarati influence. But Gandhi was a very eclectic man. I mean, if you look at it, Ruskin has impacted him. He has read the Bible, he has read the Quran, and he has read many, many people in that way, so that he becomes truly a Vishwamanav, to use Uma Shankar Joshi's term.
Hello, sir. Sir, here. He's here.
Yes, yeah.
Just now you're saying Gandhi is an athletic man. Like
Sorry?
Just now you're saying Gandhi is a very athletic man like that.
Eclectic, yeah.
Yeah, like that, like when we say Gujarat, we say like businessman, like or politicians like that. But in recent times, the dominance of Gujaratis in cricket, it's actually overlooked. Like from the arguably the greatest bowler Bumrah to like best.
Yes, Bumrah is a Gujarati for me, yeah.
Best all-rounders from Gujarat. And if you see in diaspora of other countries, like teams also, you see so many Gujaratis are playing in there also. Now the ICC chairman is from Gujarat. So like it's more like
Actually, there is a chapter. I didn't ask him about it, but please go ahead
No,
and share
there's a
that.
chapter about cricket, and it goes back to Ranji, actually. Not just Ranji, who was Gujarati, but you have to, actually, if you look deeper into it, most of the early Indian cricket teams were sponsored by Gujarati businessmen or Gujarati princes. The captain of the first Indian team to go to England was, of course, Maharaja Patiala, but the vice captain was the Maharaja of Limdi, which is a princely state in Gujarat. Maharaja Porbandar was involved with cricket. So the royal patronage, there's a book by Richard Cashman called Patrons, Players and Crowds, about how Indian cricket started. And if you look at that history, there's a lot of Gujarati element there. Sponsorship, Nirlon, Mafatlal companies, Gujarati, Virenchi Sagar and the Mafatlal, they supported ACC was a Tata company. For me, Tata is a Gujarati, right? At that time, they also sponsored cricket. Vinu Bankad, Ashok Bankad, Polly Umrigar, Nari Contractor, Rusi Surti, KC Ibrahim, Colonel Mistry. Gujaratis have been part of the Indian cricket scene for a very, very long time. Yajurvendra Singh, again a Gujarati. Cheteshwar Pujara. I mean, it just goes on. Farooq Engineer. So there's a very strong tradition, which is now strong because of the two Pandya brothers and Bumrah and so on. But it's Parthiv Patel. I mean, I can keep you busy for the rest of the evening. Jadeja, of course. Yeah. And Ranji, so we can't forget Dulip as a result.
Already you are seeing 3 teams from Gujarat, like Baroda, Saurashtra.
Yeah, 3 teams from the state who play. And there used to be a 4th, Navanagar, in the early days. And they won the Ranji Trophy in 1935.
Thank you, sir.
Last question, please. We can take 2.
The gentleman at the back, but you'll need a mic.
Hello.
I can, yeah. Dominance, but in which field?
We are dominating every field. Any specifics?
We can see everywhere, whether it's business or in sports or in
Why are we
politics.
like that only?
Yeah, why like, maybe.
No, I wouldn't say that Gujaratis are unique in this. There are many areas where Gujaratis are not dominant. But the thing is that we are increasingly seen as dominant initially in business and nothing else. But politics, of course, we had Gandhi and Patel, but they had become national figures. But we had Morarji Desai in between, and Dhebar and Madhav Singh Solanki, all stalwarts.
Yeah, that's the point I'm saying. So
Yeah.
what are the traits which make Gujaratis dominant across various fields?
I think it's a self-belief is one, but again, they are not unique. Sikhs are exactly like that. You know, Bengalis have that, Malayalis have that, Tamils have that. So I don't want to make a unique sui generis case about Gujaratis, but that is certainly one of them. The other is the ability, and I think this goes into why to be successful, you have to be pragmatic, to know where the risks are and when to get off. And one thing that allows us to become pragmatic is the ability to compartmentalize. We are able to not get too emotional about decisions. So we could be a trader in diamonds and Jain and look at the other way, the fact that how diamonds are being procured from the killing fields of West Africa. Similarly, we could run a very sprawling empire of supermarkets which sells meat and condoms while we have very strict rules about our daughters and our sons about what they can eat and what they cannot. So there is that ability. So about being very clear about where we want to be, the rest of the relations are fine. And I think that ability to be from one to another, I think that's one of it. But there are many areas where we are not prominent. Filmmaking, there are some good examples, but Bengalis beat us, Malayalis meet us hollow in that.
Can you tell us the story about the chef in America as a sign of good Gujarati pragmatism?
So,
We'll
yeah,
end with
Chintan
that.
Pandya is a very good example. Thank you. He runs this restaurants called Sema and Ada and Masala Wala and Son and all that. And I said, don't you want a Michelin star? He said, no. I want my business to be a $10 million business first. So his priorities are very clear. And you go to his restaurant, wonderful food. You can't get... New York Times had a piece actually saying how you can game the system to try to get a reservation because the restaurants are always booked. In the first 5 minutes, you'd lose a spot. But it's very clear that this is why I'm here. I asked, why don't you start a Gujarati restaurant? He said, who will come to eat it? Every Gujarati will say, my mother makes it better or my wife makes it better. So they will never come. Or they'll come once to bring their foreign guests. I can't do that. I need to sell here. So I will sell what the market wants. So that is what makes us what we are. That we know what people want and we deliver it.
With that, thank you very much, Salil. Thank you all.